The alley behind the Roxy Theater on Sunset Strip in Los Angeles was darker than it had any right to be on that October night in 1985. Ozzy Osbourne had just finished a sold-out show, his voice still hoarse from 2 hours of screaming into microphones, his shirt soaked through with sweat. He had told his security team he needed 5 minutes alone, just 5 minutes to smoke a cigarette and feel like a normal person before being shoved into a limousine and driven back to his hotel. Those 5 minutes would change 2 lives forever, though neither man knew it at the time. Ozzy leaned against the brick wall of the theater, his leather jacket creaking as he fumbled for his cigarette lighter. The night air was cool, a welcome relief from the heat of the stage lights. He could still hear the muffled roar of fans being ushered out of the venue, still feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins. At 36 years old, Ozzy was at the peak of his solo career, having finally escaped the shadow of Black Sabbath and proven he could stand on his own. Money was flowing, fame was intoxicating, and the world seemed to belong to him. He never heard them coming. One moment he was alone, the next moment 3 men had materialized from the shadows of the alley. The first thing Ozzy noticed was the knife, a long blade that caught the weak light from a distant street lamp. The second thing he noticed was the desperation in their eyes, the kind of hunger that made men dangerous. The tallest of the 3 stepped forward and demanded Ozzy's wallet in a voice that tried to sound threatening, but came out shaky and uncertain. Ozzy's first instinct was to laugh. After everything he had survived, all the excess and danger he had lived through, he was going to get mugged in an alley behind his own concert. But the knife looked very real, and the men looked very desperate, and Ozzy's hands went to his pockets. He pulled out his wallet, thick with cash from merchandise sales and appearance fees. He held it out, trying to keep his hand steady, trying not to show fear. That was when the 4th man appeared. He came from the opposite end of the alley, moving fast but not running, his footsteps barely making a sound. He was older than the muggers, maybe in his 50s, with a weathered face covered by an unkempt gray beard. He wore a military jacket that had seen better days, patches barely visible in the dim light, and carried himself with a posture that spoke of discipline, despite his obvious homelessness. His eyes were sharp, alert, scanning the situation with the kind of tactical awareness that only came from training and experience. The homeless man did not shout or threaten. He simply walked directly into the space between Ozzy and the muggers, positioning himself as a human shield. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried the weight of absolute authority. He told the 3 men that they needed to leave now, that they did not want the trouble that would come if they stayed. The man with the knife laughed nervously and asked who the hell this homeless old man thought he was. The veteran, because that is what he clearly was, did not answer with words. He moved with a speed that seemed impossible for someone his age, someone who looked like he had been living on the streets. His hand shot out and grabbed the wrist holding the knife, twisting it with practiced precision. The knife clattered to the ground. In the same fluid motion, the veteran swept the mugger's legs and put him on his back on the dirty alley pavement. The other 2 muggers stood frozen for a moment, then turned and ran, their footsteps echoing off the alley walls. The veteran helped the man on the ground to his feet, speaking to him quietly, almost gently, telling him that this was not the way, that there were better options, that desperation did not have to lead to violence. Then he released the man and stepped back, giving him space to leave. The mugger scrambled away, not looking back, leaving his knife abandoned on the ground. For a long moment, Ozzy and the veteran stood in the alley, both breathing hard, both processing what had just happened. Ozzy broke the silence first, asking the obvious question about who the man was and why he had helped a stranger. The veteran shrugged and said his name was James Caldwell, that he was a Marine, or at least he used to be before Vietnam took everything he had. He said he was trained to protect people and old habits died hard, even when you were living in cardboard boxes and scrounging through dumpsters for food. Ozzy looked at James Caldwell, really looked at him for the first time. Beneath the dirt and the worn clothing and the signs of street living, Ozzy saw something that made his chest tighten. He saw dignity. He saw honor. He saw a man who had sacrificed everything for his country and received nothing in return. James stood there with his back straight despite everything, with pride still visible in his posture despite his circumstances. Ozzy did something that surprised both of them. He opened his wallet, the same wallet the muggers had been trying to steal, and pulled out every bill inside. There had to be $3,000 in cash, maybe more. He held it out to James and told him to take it, that it was the least he could do for someone who had just saved his life. James looked at the money for a long moment, then shook his head. He said he did not help people for payment, that some things were more important than money, that his service to his country had taught him about duty and honor, even if his country had forgotten about him. Ozzy insisted. He said the money was not payment, it was gratitude. It was one human being helping another. James remained firm. He would not take the money. The two men stood at an impasse, staring at each other across the dirty alley, separated by pride and principle. Finally, Ozzy proposed a compromise. He asked if James would at least join him for food, a real meal, not whatever scraps he had been surviving on. James hesitated, then nodded slowly, saying he could not remember the last time someone had offered him that simple dignity. They left the alley together, Ozzy the rock star and James the homeless veteran, walking down Sunset Strip at midnight like old friends. Ozzy took James to an all-night diner he knew, a place where the staff was used to seeing musicians and night people and did not judge anyone based on appearance. They sat in a corner booth and Ozzy watched as James ordered carefully, reading the menu with the kind of deliberation that came from rarely having choices. Over burgers and coffee, James Caldwell told Ozzy his story. He had enlisted in the Marines at 18, full of patriotic fire and the belief that he was doing something important. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam, seen things that no human being should have to see, done things that haunted him every night. He had come home in 1973 to a country that did not want to hear about his service, that blamed soldiers for the war, that turned away from veterans with the same determination it had turned away from the war itself. James had tried to readjust to civilian life. He had tried to hold down jobs, tried to maintain relationships, tried to be the man he had been before the war. But the nightmares came every night, the flashbacks could be triggered by any loud noise, and the anger that lived inside him was a constant companion he could not shake. He had lost jobs because of his unpredictability. He had lost his wife because of his inability to connect emotionally after everything he had seen. He had lost his apartment, then his car, then his dignity piece by piece until he found himself on the streets with nothing but his memories and his training. James talked about the other veterans he met on the streets, dozens of them, maybe hundreds throughout Los Angeles alone. Men who had served their country and returned to find no support system, no mental health care, no acknowledgement of their sacrifice. Men who self-medicated with alcohol and drugs, who could not hold down jobs because of their trauma, who were invisible to a society that preferred to forget about uncomfortable truths. James had been living on the streets for 8 years by the time he met Ozzy, surviving day by day, helping other homeless veterans when he could, maintaining his dignity through sheer force of will. Ozzy listened to every word, and something fundamental shifted inside him. He had always known intellectually that veterans suffered after service, but hearing James talk about the reality of it, seeing the living proof of abandonment sitting across from him, made it real in a way nothing else had. Ozzy started asking questions about what could help, what resources existed, what barriers prevented veterans from getting support. James answered honestly, explaining the bureaucratic nightmares of the VA system, the waiting list for mental health services, the catch-22 situations where you needed. They talked until dawn began to lighten the sky outside the diner windows. When they finally left, Ozzy asked James if he could do anything to help beyond just this one meal. James thought for a moment, then said that if Ozzy really wanted to help, he should tell people about veterans like him, use his platform to raise awareness. Because individual charity was kind, but systemic change was what was really needed. Ozzy promised he would do exactly that. Before they parted ways, Ozzy insisted that James take his phone number. He wrote it on a napkin from the diner, telling James to call if he ever needed anything at all. James folded the napkin carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. He shook Ozzy's hand with a grip that was still strong despite everything, thanked him for treating him like a human being instead of an invisible problem, and walked back toward whatever shelter he called home that week. Ozzy watched him go. This man who had saved his life and asked for nothing in return. He got into his limousine when it arrived, but instead of going back to his hotel, he asked the driver to follow James at a distance. He watched as the veteran walked several blocks to an underpass where other homeless people had set up a small encampment. He watched as James was greeted by others who clearly knew and respected him. He watched until James disappeared into a makeshift tent, and only then did Ozzy tell his driver to take him to his hotel. That night changed Ozzy in ways he could not fully articulate at the time. True to his promise, he started speaking about veteran homelessness in interviews, started making donations to veteran support organizations, started using his fame to shine a light on an issue that many preferred to ignore. But he never forgot James Caldwell, never stopped thinking about the man who had risked himself for a stranger and asked for nothing in return. Years passed. Ozzy's career continued its roller coaster trajectory of success and controversy, triumph and tragedy. He got sober, relapsed, got sober again. He became a reality TV star, introducing a new generation to his particular brand of chaos. He dealt with health issues, family crises, and the normal difficulties of aging in the public eye. Through it all, he kept that napkin with James Caldwell's name written on it in a drawer in his home office, a reminder of a debt he felt he could never fully repay. The problem was that Ozzy had no idea how to find James. He had no last known address, no social security number, no way to track someone who existed largely outside the official systems of society. Every few years, Ozzy would ask his assistant to try to locate James Caldwell, to search through veteran databases or homeless shelter records, but nothing ever came of it. The man had vanished as thoroughly as he had appeared that night in 1985. Then in 2019, 34 years after that night in the alley, Ozzy was at home recovering from a series of health crises that had nearly killed him. He was in his 70s now, his body bearing the accumulated damage of decades of excess and the recent trauma of serious illness. He was going through old files and memorabilia, the kind of reflection that comes with age and illness, when he found the napkin. It was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still readable. James Caldwell, Marine, hero. Ozzy sat holding that napkin for a long time, thinking about the man who had saved his life and disappeared. He thought about all the years that had passed, about whether James was even still alive. He made a decision then that would consume him for the next several years. He was going to find James Caldwell, no matter what it took, no matter how long it required. He owed the man at least the chance to say thank you properly. Ozzy hired a team of private investigators who specialized in finding missing persons, particularly homeless individuals and veterans who had fallen through the cracks. He gave them every detail he could remember from that night in 1985. Every word of their conversation at the diner, every piece of information about James's service and circumstances. The investigators began the painstaking work of searching through decades of military records, homeless shelter logs, police reports, and hospital admissions. The search was more difficult than anyone anticipated. James Caldwell was a common name, and military records from the Vietnam era were often incomplete or poorly organized. Many homeless shelters did not keep detailed records, especially going back to the 1980s and 1990s. The investigators hit dead end after dead end, finding dozens of James Caldwells who were not the right person, tracking leads that went nowhere, following trails that stopped cold. Months turned into a year, then 2 years. The investigation cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Ozzy's assistants gently suggested that maybe it was time to accept that James Caldwell might not want to be found, or might not be alive to be found. Ozzy refused to give up. He had spent his entire life being stubborn, being the person who refused to quit no matter how bad things looked, and he was not about to stop now. The breakthrough came in late 2023, almost 4 years after the search began. One of the investigators was going through old Veterans Hospital records in Northern California and found an admission from 1998 for a James Caldwell who matched the approximate age and military service history. The address listed was for a small town called Eureka on the Northern California coast. It was a long shot, a thread so thin it might snap if pulled, but it was more than they had found before. The investigators traveled to Eureka and began the slow work of asking questions, showing old photographs that Ozzy's security team had taken in the alley that night without Ozzy knowing. Talking to veterans groups and homeless advocates, slowly a picture began to emerge. A man matching James Caldwell's description had lived in Eureka in the late 1990s and early 2000s, working odd jobs and staying in a trailer park on the edge of town. He had been well-liked, known for helping other veterans, remembered for his dignity and his Marine Corps bearing. The trail led to a small assisted living facility about 20 miles outside Eureka, a place that specialized in housing low-income elderly veterans. The administrator checked their records and confirmed that yes, they had a resident named James Caldwell, a Vietnam veteran who had moved in 6 years ago after decades of homelessness. He was 78 years old now, in declining health, living quietly and bothering no one. The investigators called Ozzy immediately. After almost 4 years of searching, after hundreds of false leads and disappointed hopes, they had found James Caldwell. He was alive. He was safe. And he had no idea that one of the most famous rock stars in the world had been looking for him for years. Ozzy flew to California as soon as his health allowed. He brought Sharon with him because Sharon was his anchor and his strength, and he needed both for this moment. They drove to the assisted living facility on a cold February morning in 2024, almost 39 years after that night in the alley. Ozzy was nervous in a way he had not been nervous in decades, not since his first solo performances after leaving Black Sabbath. The administrator led them to James Caldwell's room in the facility. It was small but clean, decorated with Marine Corps memorabilia and old photographs. James was sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at the Northern California rain. He turned when they entered, and Ozzy felt his breath catch. The man was older, much older, his beard now completely white, his face marked by decades of hard living. But his eyes were the same, sharp and alert, and his bearing was still unmistakably military. James looked at Ozzy with no recognition at first. Then something flickered in his expression, a memory surfacing from nearly 4 decades ago. He said slowly, uncertainly, that Ozzy looked familiar, like someone he might have met once a long time ago. Ozzy stepped forward and said simply that he was the man James had saved from muggers in an alley behind the Roxy Theater in 1985. James was quiet for a long moment. Then his eyes widened and a smile spread across his weathered face. He said he remembered that night, remembered the skinny rock star who had tried to give him money and settle for buying him dinner instead. He asked what in the world Ozzy Osbourne was doing in a veterans home in Northern California almost 40 years later. Ozzy sat down across from James and told him everything. He told him about carrying the napkin all these years, about never forgetting the debt he owed, about spending 4 years and more money than he cared to calculate searching for the man who had saved his life. He told James that he had wanted to say thank you properly, to do something more than just buy a meal, to acknowledge the gift that James had given him by risking himself for a stranger. James listened to all of this with an expression that cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of tears. When Ozzy finished, James said quietly that he had not expected to ever be remembered, that most people he had helped over the years had forgotten him as soon as he was out of sight. He said that being homeless made you invisible, that people looked through you instead of at you, and that he had made peace with being forgotten. Ozzy asked James about his life after that night, about how he had ended up in Eureka, about the decades in between. James told a story of continuing struggle and occasional grace. He had stayed in Los Angeles for a few more years after meeting Ozzy, continuing to live on the streets, continuing to help other veterans when he could. In the mid-1990s, he had finally connected with a VA program that got him into treatment for PTSD and helped him find housing. He had worked various jobs, always just barely getting by, never quite able to fully escape the trauma of his service. He had moved to Eureka in search of a quieter life, away from the chaos of Los Angeles. He had lived in a trailer for several years, working part-time jobs and volunteering with local veteran organizations. His health had begun failing in his early 70s, and he had moved into this assisted living facility when he could no longer care for himself independently. He said he had no complaints, that this room with its window and its peace was more than he had ever expected to have, that after years on the streets, any form of stability felt like luxury. Ozzy listened to all of this, and then he explained what he wanted to do. He wanted to move James to a better facility closer to Los Angeles, somewhere with better medical care and more amenities. He wanted to set up a trust fund that would ensure James never had to worry about money again. He wanted to pay for any medical treatments James needed. And he wanted James to know that what he had done that night in 1985 had mattered, that his service had mattered, that he mattered. James was overwhelmed. He tried to protest that it was too much, that he did not deserve such generosity for doing what any decent person would have done. Ozzy cut him off gently but firmly. He said that James had spent his entire life giving to others, sacrificing for others, helping others while asking for nothing in return. It was time for someone to give back to James, and Ozzy had the resources and the determination to do it. Over the following weeks, Ozzy's team worked to arrange everything. They found a beautiful assisted living community in Los Angeles that specialized in veteran care, with full medical facilities and staff trained in dealing with PTSD. They set up financial arrangements that would cover James's care for the rest of his life, with additional funds for anything he wanted or needed. They arranged for James to be transported comfortably to his new home, with Ozzy and Sharon accompanying him on the trip. But Ozzy did not stop there. He asked James if he would be willing to share his story publicly to help raise awareness about veteran homelessness and the need for better support systems. James agreed, saying that if his story could help other veterans, then everything he had been through would have meaning beyond just survival. Ozzy arranged for interviews, for appearances, for James to speak at veteran advocacy events. The story of the homeless Marine who had saved Ozzy Osbourne and been found almost 40 years later captured public attention in exactly the way Ozzy had hoped. The media coverage led to increased donations to veteran organizations, to renewed public focus on the issue of veteran homelessness, to political pressure for better VA services. James Caldwell became, in his late 70s, an unexpected advocate for his fellow veterans, using his platform to speak truth about the failures of the system and the resilience of those who had served. He did it all with the same dignity he had shown that night in the alley, never seeking glory, always pointing attention back to the broader issue. A year after they reunited, Ozzy arranged a special event. He organized a benefit concert for veteran homelessness, bringing together other musicians and celebrities who supported the cause. At the climax of the evening, Ozzy brought James on stage in front of 15,000 people and told the story of how this Marine had saved his life decades ago. The crowd gave James a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes. James stood there with tears streaming down his weathered face, experiencing perhaps for the first time the gratitude and recognition that should have been given to him and all veterans long ago. James Caldwell lived for 3 more years in comfort and dignity, surrounded by other veterans who became his friends, with medical care that managed his health issues, and with the knowledge that he had made a difference not just in Ozzy's life, but in the lives of countless other veterans who benefited from the renewed focus on their needs. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep in 2027 at the age of 81, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including Ozzy and Sharon and many of the veterans whose lives had been changed by the attention James's story had brought to their struggles. Ozzy spoke at the funeral. He talked about debt and gratitude, about honor and service, about what it means to truly sacrifice for others. He said that James Caldwell had saved his life twice, once in that alley by stopping muggers, and once by showing him what real courage and dignity looked like. He said that he had spent 4 years searching for James, but that in reality, James had never been lost. He had always been exactly where he was supposed to be, helping others, maintaining his honor, living by the code he learned as a Marine. The story does not really end there, though. Ozzy and Sharon established a foundation in James Caldwell's name, dedicated to helping homeless veterans find housing, medical care, and support. The foundation has helped thousands of veterans in the years since, becoming one of the most effective veteran advocacy organizations in the country. Every person who is helped by the foundation represents a ripple effect from that one night in 1985. From one man's decision to step between danger and a stranger, from one rock star's refusal to forget a debt. In Ozzy's home, in a frame on the wall of his office, hangs that old yellowed napkin with James Caldwell's name written in faded ink. Next to it is a photograph of 2 old men, one a rock legend and one a homeless veteran, sitting together and smiling like the old friends they became. The photograph was taken at the assisted living facility during one of Ozzy's visits. Both men in their 70s, both survivors of different kinds of wars, both understanding finally that sometimes the greatest gift we can give is simply seeing each other, really seeing each other and choosing to help. And somewhere, in the hearts of thousands of veterans who have been helped by the foundation that bears his name, James Caldwell's legacy lives on, not as a homeless man or as someone who needed saving, but as a Marine who never stopped serving, who maintained his honor even in the worst circumstances, and who proved that one moment of courage and compassion can echo through decades and change countless lives. Because in the end, that is what this story is really about. Not about a celebrity's gratitude or a feel-good reunion, but about the truth that every life has value, that service and sacrifice deserve recognition, that society's failures to support its veterans are choices that can be changed, and that sometimes the people we pass without seeing, the invisible homeless on our streets, are heroes who deserve so much more than our indifference. James Caldwell never wanted to be famous. He just wanted to serve, to help, to maintain his dignity and honor in a world that made both almost impossible. And in the end, his story did exactly what he hoped it would do. It helped other veterans. It changed minds and opened wallets and shifted policies. It reminded people that behind every homeless person is a story, a history, a life that matters. Ozzy Osbourne spent 4 years and tremendous resources finding one man to say thank you. But in doing so, he helped thousands. That is the real magic of this story. One moment of kindness in an alley, preserved in memory for decades, transformed into action that ripples outward in ways that can never be fully calculated. One man saved one life in 1985, and that one life spent decades trying to repay the debt. And in trying to repay it, created a legacy that will help veterans for generations to come. And somewhere, if you believe in such things, James Caldwell is smiling his quiet smile, standing at attention one final time, proud of what his service ultimately accomplished, grateful that his sacrifice was finally recognized, at peace knowing that other veterans will not be forgotten the way his generation was forgotten. Semper Fi, James Caldwell. Your service mattered, you mattered, and you are finally, truly home.